Now that we have an understanding about how graphs work inside of Illustrator, let's dive into some of the settings that allow us to customize exactly how we want a graph to look. So in this movie, I'm going to start by creating a new document, Command N here inside of Illustrator. I'll just choose some basic settings here, working with a letter size. My unit is set to inches and my orientation is set to wide, and I'll click OK. Now I want to start by creating a graph object here, so I'm going to go to my graph tool. I'm going to use the column graph tool. I'm going to click right about over here, and I'm going to choose to enter a specific width and height for my chart. Now remember, the values that I'm entering here represent the bounding area for where the chart itself will appear, not the value or category axes, and not the legend either. So I'm going to use a width of 6 and a height of 4. I'm going to click OK, and I'm going to import some data. So I'm going to click on this button here to import data, navigate to Chapter 3, Customizing Charts, and I'll choose the U.S. Energy Production 2011 file, which is again a text file that I exported out of Excel, and I'll choose Open, and that data now comes in here. This data does actually have some decimal points in it, so I'm going to choose to specify 1 digit for my decimals. Click OK. It's important to realize, by the way, that the data is still there, even if I don't see the decimal points. This is just a way for me to display that here inside of Illustrator. And now I'm going to click on the check mark to apply that. Great. So I'm going to close the data window right now. And it's important to realize that what Illustrator has created is indeed some kind of a special object called a graph. Basically, a whole bunch of groups kind of sewn together into this special kind of an object. But at the end of the day, they're all still objects. I have the ability to use my direct selection tool to select different elements and change their colors, select some text, and actually change some of the text as well. But because Illustrator takes the trouble to actually turn these into separate subgroups, I can use the group selection tool inside of Illustrator to make it easier to modify some of these settings. Like for example, if I want to change the color of the nuclear bars inside of this chart, you'll notice that if I take my direct selection tool and I hold down the Option or Alt key on my keyboard, that toggles the group selection tool, and I can keep that button down, the Option or the Alt button, and click once on the square here in the legend. If I click a second time, it now selects everything else in the upper group. So now I can see that both of these are currently selected, and now I could change my color to something else, maybe like this orange color. And let's actually set the stroke to none. Now I haven't ungrouped this graph. I can still modify the data and the color will stay. So for example, maybe I want to change the color of the renewables section. Maybe I want that to be green. I can again Option or Alt click on this box right here in the legend, click again to now select all the other parts in that series, and then choose some kind of a green color. I can also set it stroke to none as well. So I have the ability to modify colors very easily, just like I would any other object inside of Illustrator. If I want to change the text, for example, I'll hold down the Option key and select the word nuclear, but then I'll basically click on it again, and now you can see that all the other text elements, all the labels that appear for this legend right here, become selected. So now I can change this to, for example, maybe Chaparral Pro, and change the point size to maybe 18, and maybe change the fill color of that to something like maybe a dark blue or purple. So you do have a tremendous amount of creative freedom when working with graphs inside of Illustrator. But let's actually go into the graph settings themselves and see how we can make some other adjustments. I'm going to use my selection tool, and I'm going to select the entire graph. Next, I'm going to go to the Object menu. I'm going to scroll down to where it says Graph, and I'm going to choose this option here called Type. This brings up a dialog box, and as I had mentioned previously, unfortunately, there's no preview button here inside of this dialog, so it's just not as easy to experiment with these. Now, first of all, right off the bat, you can see that I have an option for all the different types of graphs. So if I wanted to actually view this information or this data as a pie chart instead of as a column chart, I could simply click on the pie chart right here and click OK. Notice, by the way, that the colors and the typefaces that I've chosen, that still stays the same, but I've now visualized this data using a different chart type. Let me go back over here to Object, Graph, and Type. And again, remember, I have to keep going back to this dialog box, and you may find it useful if you do this kind of work a lot to assign a custom keyboard shortcut to the Graph Type command. That way you can very easily bring this dialog box back up. Let's switch back here to the column chart. And you'll see that I have here some options where it says Style. I can add a drop shadow, which by the way, I'll tell you, doesn't really help at all. It's not a real soft drop shadow that you might be used to seeing inside of Illustrator. This feature was added way before Illustrator had the ability to create those nice soft drop shadows. So you may find it more useful simply that when you're done creating your chart to apply the regular drop shadow effect that you may be used to. However, I do have the ability to add a legend across the top. If I do that, you'll see the legend now appears across the top of my chart, not along the side. Once again, I'm going to go back to the Object menu, choose Graph and Type. You'll see that over here where it says Value Axis, which remember is this axis over here, currently appears on the left side, but I can choose to have Illustrator display it on either the right side or even on both sides. Now, let me actually go over here to the top where we see this setting here called Graph Options. If I click on that, I can see that I have the ability to specify individual settings for the value axis, which again is this axis right here, or the category axis, which is the one that appears across the bottom. Let's start by first focusing on the value axis. Notice over here where it says tick marks, right now the length is set to short, and that's what these little lines here represent. I can turn them off so that they don't appear at all, or I can choose full width, and full width will actually extend these lines all the way across the chart. I also have the ability to add labels, and I have something called a prefix and a suffix. Let's say, for example, these values represent something like money. I could set a prefix that has maybe a $sign, and if I were to go ahead now and choose OK, I can see now that a $sign has been added in front of all these values. Maybe these numbers represent a percentage. Well, I can again go back to the Object menu, choose Graph, Type, go back to Value Axis, and get rid of the prefix, but add a suffix of a %sign. Now when I click OK, I'll see that a %sign is added towards the end of the value. Of course, you could have both a prefix and a suffix as well, and a suffix doesn't have to be a single character. For example, if each of these represented millions of dollars, I could have a prefix of a $sign, and then I could have a suffix of the actual word million. You can also see how the tick marks now extend all the way across the chart. Let's go back because I want to show you one other setting. I'm going to go to Object, Graph, and then choose Type. Notice over here where it says Options, I have something here called a column width and a cluster width. I can modify these values to control how much space each of these columns actually take up. For example, if I set my column width to 50%, I can click OK, and I have much narrower columns. Just be aware that you're not limited to only going to 100% for these columns. So for example, if I go back to Object, Graph, and then Type, I can choose a column width of 150% and click OK, and now I can see that they actually overlap. It's this setting specifically why when I go to the Object menu and I choose Graph Type, that I also have a setting for first row in front and first column in front, because that will allow me to specify which of these columns should be displayed in front or behind each other when they overlap. By the way, the same settings that we've been working with for the value axis also apply to the category axis. Now there is one other setting here if I go back to the value axis, which is something called tick values. This is actually a very important setting when working with graphs, especially when working with multiple graphs. In fact, I feel that it's so important, it warrants its own movie talking about it. So for now, I'm going to click on the Cancel button, and we're done with talking about how we might modify some of the settings for graph elements inside of Illustrator. In the next movie, we're going to focus on exactly what the tick values actually do to a chart in Illustrator.